Hereford, Warwickshire, Oxfordshire, Thames Valley, Bucks, Berks, Gloucestershire. There's been people working furiously to put this together, so a massive thank you to start with. But a bigger thank you to those of you who've subscribed through Eventbrite to join us today. I'm really pleased that we can be doing this virtual Pride series of webinars leading up to the event on Saturday. So it really is an honour to host the first one. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. So please ask questions throughout using the chat function. So you should see a speech bubble icon. If you open that, there is a chat function. And there is a drop-down menu next to the words to. You can select David Wasley Wood from there and ask your questions. Please keep them coming throughout, and then at the end of the session we'll have Q&A. So we'll start to pose those questions to various panel members. Massive thank you to Nick from Stonewall, to Bergs, that's Rachel, number one, so we're using Bergs, who's from Gloucester Readers, and also to Rachel from Derbyshire Fire and Rescue Service, who's coming to talk to us about her experiences as well. So thank you to you for giving your time up for us. And we'll introduce the speakers as we move on throughout the session. But just first of all, a little bit from me about why am I involved in this? It's not just a talking head. I'm a Chief Fire Officer of Gloucestershire Fire and Rescue Service and Director of Community Safety for Gloucestershire County Council. And what else could I be doing on a Monday evening? Well, frankly, nothing, because I am absolutely passionate about what we're going to talk about over the rest of this week. And why is that? A huge number of reasons, and primarily because I get hugely upset, angry, sad about injustice and about unfairness. And I have been a public servant career long, and I genuinely believe that we serve and understand the communities that we work for much better if we fully represent and we are understanding of the differences, the difficulties, the challenges that all of us face in life, but particularly people with protected characteristics, people who have been treated unjustly or do suffer unjust treatment. So it's kind of, I'd verge on using inappropriate descriptions to say that it's almost become a bit of a crusade of mine in the past, and sometimes it's got me into hot water, but I make no apologies for that, because genuinely, I do believe that inclusion in creating cultures where people feel supported, we can support their well-being, and they can genuinely be themselves in our organisations and in society, is when we support the well-being of people and we support better outcomes for both those individuals and therefore our organisations. What isn't it? This is not how to do inclusion. It's not how to do positive action and how to do inclusion. I have so much to learn. I get so much wrong, and there is huge amounts that I don't know. Colleagues recently, through challenges I've been dealing with, have asked me, you know, if you could walk a mile in my shoes, and I've said, well, unfortunately, I can't, because I'm not you, and I can't experience what it's like to be you, but help me understand. So this, for me, is a great learning event. So thank you for subscribing. Please engage, because I know we as a panel, and I certainly will learn as much from you and your questions as you will from the great speakers that we've got this evening. It's a safe space, so please do ask those questions. You've got that ability within the chat bar to ask the questions, and we will give you the best answer that we possibly can, or hopefully direct you to a resource if we can't answer your question, because we haven't got all the answers. As I say, this is about exploration, learning, and please let's do that in a really respectful way. So really looking forward to this evening. Can't wait for Wednesday's session. I'm supposed to be showing you something whilst I'm talking about that, so I will pop up the screen that you should be able to see there, which is outlining what we're doing this evening, talking about positive action inclusion, and then it goes on to look at the trans awareness and trans acceptance on Wednesday at the same time, and LGBTQ plus and hate crime on Friday. So please do make yourselves available for those sessions as well, if you can, subscribing through the Eventbrite login as you've done for this event. I think that's probably enough from me, because I think you've subscribed today to listen to Nick, Bergs and Rachel talk and ask some questions. So let's get on with that. And not to set you up in any way, but I'm really looking forward to it as well, 3 speakers. With that, I'll introduce Nick Slater from Stonewall. So got a bit of a pen picture, Nick. Hopefully you sent it in and it's not embarrassing as somebody else has made up. So Nick works at Stonewall, which is Europe's largest LGBT rights charity. He also works for local government and other public sector organisations in London and the Southwest through the Diversity Champions programme, which is looking at improving workplace equality, diversity and inclusion for marginalised and underrepresented groups. And I know in the past, in my previous organisations, I've done quite a bit of work, but more importantly, received loads of support from Stonewall. So really looking forward to Nick's presentation. So on that, David, do you pass the presenter over to Nick, or do I do that?
Yeah, he's got it.
I think I've got it. I hope so.
Super. Thank you and welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Wayne. Right, first things first is sharing my screen. Let's get this done. Okay, I can't see the PowerPoint presentation as an option to share, which is of course going to happen the first time we're doing this. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just opening it back up again. Aha, here we go. Right, I hope everyone can see. Can I get a yes from someone on the panel that you can see?
Yeah, we've got you, Nick.
Brilliant. Sorry for that slight kind of pause, but thanks for the introduction, Wayne. I'm really, really happy to be here. That little bio was exactly right. I do work at Stonewall. And you'll see here I've got closed captions on my presentation. They are just generated by PowerPoint. They're not perfect, but I hope that does help with accessibility. But don't blame me if it says something there that I haven't quite said. As Wayne said, I'm a client account manager for the public sector. That means I work with a whole range of public sector organisations throughout London and the Southwest specifically, local government, fire and rescue services, police services, universities, NHS trusts as well. My pronouns are he and him. And I'm going to talk for 15 minutes about the workplace specifically and how to recruit, and just as importantly, how to retain LGBT talent. Firstly, I just wanted to say it's so great to hear Wayne's passion about this. I'm sure anyone who's worked with Stonewall before will hear us talk a lot about how important senior leadership is when having consistent buy-in and genuine, authentic buy-in for LGBT inclusion in the workplace. And it really can help drive it. The range of organisations I work with, the ones which are really pushing forward with LGBT inclusion are the ones that have the senior leadership behind them. So it's clear that that's the case here. And for anyone who doesn't yet, there's loads of ways to try and get senior leaders to buy in. And I'm sure Wayne as well would be more than helpful to speak to the other people in senior positions who want to know how they can do that. I will also say it would be great, as Wayne said, to have questions throughout. I'm not used to doing this format. I've done a few of them. I'm sure we'll be doing a lot more. It would be really nice to be able to see all of you and interact. But in the absence of that, please do pop questions in the chat. I'm going to start off this presentation with talking about a little bit of context. I will go into how you can improve the workplace for LGBT people, but I think importantly, it's always worth thinking about why we're doing this work. So some of the stats on the screen here are taken from our LGBT in Britain report. That was a report we ran a couple of years ago that looked at the experience of LGBT people across the whole of the UK. And we did it in collaboration with YouGov. That report found that almost 1 in 5 LGBT people who were looking for work said they'd been discriminated against because of their LGBT identity, so their sexual orientation or gender identity. We also found that more than a third of LGBT people for work are worried about being discriminated against. Now, this is the one that really gets me, and I see it a lot as well when we do work in the health service and people not accessing healthcare for fear of. And the same here, people might not apply for a job for fear of being discriminated against. Now, this is a barrier that I think has to be broken down, and one where there's some really tangible things that workplaces can do. Because if you can make yourself as a workplace, make yourself out there as an LGBT employer and showing prospective applicants how you're inclusive, that can help to bring that percentage down. There's also a quote here from Henry, one of the people we spoke to, talking about applying for jobs. Now, Henry says, the job application goes smoothly when they read my name and assume I'm cis, but during interviews, things clearly change because I'm not cis passing and my legal documents are in my birth name due to not having money to update them. The attitude of the employer always changes when they realize I'm trans. Now, an interview process, of course, is so important when it comes to LGBT inclusion. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but this speaks to training. What training is in place for anyone in your organization with a recruitment responsibility? Are they being trained to reduce discrimination in that cycle of recruitment? Are they being trained on LGBT identities and being able to ask the right questions that aren't intrusive or aren't making assumptions? We also found that in the workplace, so after recruitment, when people come into the workplace, that again, 1 in 5 LGBT staff had been the target of negative comments or conduct from work colleagues. So you can bring down the barriers at recruitment, but at the same time, you've got to make sure when an LGBT person comes into your organization that they are in that place and able to be themselves and won't be working in a place where they could suffer bullying, harassment, or discrimination. And also we have to recognize that there are still a lot of people in the workplace who aren't out about their sexual orientation. We have seen a whole lot of legislative change over the past 30 years in the UK, but social change doesn't move in the same way. And unfortunately, we've also seen a lot of things go backwards. So I think this stat is one of the most pertinent, that you've got 2 in 5 bi people aren't out to anyone at work about their sexual orientation. And we know how much of an impact that can have with someone who's, changing their stories about what they did on the weekend at work or not going to social events for fear of being discriminated against. And the final statistic here with the bar charts is around people losing a job. And we found that 12% of Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, LGBT people had lost jobs in the last year, in comparison to 4% of white LGBT people. Now, what's really important to note here is that difference in identities and recognizing that the LGBT community, of course, isn't just a homogenous group. Too often we do get portrayed that the community is just one homogenous group and looks like one person. But of course, it's built up of a whole diaspora of amazing identities. But unfortunately, when people do share a range of different identities, they suffer a really distinct and often heightened form of discrimination and or oppression out in society, but also workplace. And that's really clearly reflected here. So moving on from some of the statistics and thinking, what can you do about it? Slightly more uplifting, I hope, and thinking about how you can make that change. The first step is clearly attracting LGBT talent. Like I said, you want people to walk through the door. You want people to be able to look at your organization as a place where they can see themselves. So a first step is advertising. Are you using any LGBT specific or diversity specific websites? The next would be really strong statements. We have to move away from statements which say, we value all diversity and that's it, or we want all people to apply. That's not clear enough for groups that have been consistently discriminated against, and for groups where they have that fear of working. You need to call it out, and you need to make sure that there's really explicit statements in your job packs, your job pages, saying how you are inclusive of LGBT identities. Again, if you've got a really thriving LGBT employee network group, and I can think I work closely with Prism at Gloucestershire County Council, you want to be able to shout about that on your recruitment site. You need to let people know that this is something inside your organisation. There might be someone who's been a really active member of their past network group, and they want to see that they can do the same in their incoming or their kind of next job. If you don't have an LGBT network group, that's fine. You can think about the inclusion activities you've done, or maybe LGBT inclusive policies that you've updated recently, and still talk about that on your recruitment pages. And the final point is what I mentioned earlier when I was talking about recruitment training. For those people that are involved in the recruitment cycle, Do you have training or guidance? It doesn't need to be a whole new suite of training if that's not possible. It can be guidance around reducing discrimination to LGBT identities in that recruitment cycle. I'm a firm believer that the majority of discrimination against LGBT people, and the vast majority, doesn't come from a place of malice. It doesn't come from people wanting to. Sometimes it does just come from people not understanding LGBT identities. And actually, for workplaces where they employ thousands of people from all different backgrounds, it's really important to have that training in place where you can upskill and uplift them, make people aware of talking about LGBT identities, and that can really help an inclusive recruitment cycle as well. Here are just a few examples of what I was talking about. We've got proud employers in the top left. It's Stonewall's LGBT inclusive job site, so you can advertise jobs on there. BAME Recruitment is just one of many examples of brilliant diversity and inclusion job sites as well. I've got a lot of clients who advertise jobs on there. In the bottom left, I've taken a screenshot from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation website. It's a third sector organisation, and I just think they talk about their staff networks really clearly and really well on their website. So this is really easy to find when you go and put yourself in the shoes of a prospective applicant. Straight away, you see about their staff networks, the ones they've got there, they've got 4 networks, and then below that, they have a little bio about each of the networks and the work they've recently done. And then more on the kind of topic of what we're on today, thinking about fire and rescue, Cheshire Fire and Rescue Service, one of our consistent kind of top employers in LGBT inclusion. They've got a page on their recruitment site about LGBT equality and what it means to them, talking about why they do it. And that's really important as well. And again, when I put myself in the shoes of someone looking to work there, it was really easy to navigate and really easy to find on the website. So an LGBT employee has joined your organization. You've got them on board. The really important part is retention and onboarding. Unfortunately, we can see a bit of a cycle. Sometimes people refer to it as a honeymoon period of people from a whole lot of different protected characteristics who might join an organization. But if that organization isn't equipped or isn't yet inclusive, they could go on a bit of a cycle and just leave within a few months. There needs to be a really explicit message reaffirming that commitment to LGBT inclusion when an employee joins. Again, information around your network or any allies initiatives on onboarding stages is really important. Policies, I mentioned that before, but of course, when you join an organization, you'll be thinking about the policies and benefits. Have you let your new employees know that they are LGBT inclusive? Or if you've got a policy which hasn't yet been updated, isn't yet fully inclusive, are you recognizing that fallibility and saying straight away, these are the steps we're taking to make sure it will be? And then finally, something that can seem like such a simple thing for so many of us, for so many cisgender people, do you allow your identity to be recognized on a workplace system? When you join that organization, so often you get asked on HR systems, or you might be having a badge for your workplace, and you have to put down your identity. Are you allowing non-binary employees to have their identities recognized, or are you allowing people to self-describe gender when it comes to workplace systems? So that's something really important when starting. It can seem like a real contradiction if an employee has joined your organization thinking that you're LGBT inclusive because they've seen a lot of your external promotion, or they found an inclusive job site. And then as soon as they join, there's kind of a first stumbling block, as it were. The next stage here is all around training. As we saw at the start, unfortunately, there is discrimination, bullying, and harassment against LGBT identities in the workplace. Sadly, that's just a fact. But there are loads of ways and loads of things we can do to bring that down and to make sure that doesn't happen in the workplace. And one of those is training. There's a whole load of different e-learning packages and in-person training that I've seen before, and some's really successful. But this is just a bit of an overview of what we at Stonewall would recommend that equality, diversity, or an inclusion training covers when it comes to LGBT inclusion. So we want to see the training really clearly focus on organizational policy and legislation. So refer to the Equality Act and also talk about your policy. What's your stance? Where is your zero tolerance stance on bullying, harassment, and discrimination? We also want you in that training to refer to examples of biphobic, homophobic, and transphobic discrimination. Of course, on top of this, I want to see examples of all sorts of discrimination, harassment against all protected characteristics. But when it comes to these three, they're really distinct types of bullying, harassment, and discrimination. And making people aware of what that looks like and what's unacceptable in the workplace not only makes people recognize their own behavior, but makes people, kind of empowers people to feel that they can report it as well if they see that happening somewhere in the workplace. Again, as we saw at the start, people with multiple identities do experience a really distinct and, like I said, often heightened form of discrimination. So when putting together examples, and the same would reflect in policies as it would for training, make sure you're giving people examples of what discrimination can look like when it is on the grounds of someone's multiple identities. And then the really important last bit is allowing people the kind of knowledge of how to challenge and how to report biphobic, homophobic, and transphobic discrimination, bullying, and harassment. Each year at Stonewall, we run an employee survey with all diversity champions across the UK. At the start of this year, we released that and we had 100,000 respondents, so a really wide range. And one of the questions we ask is whether people feel confident challenging and reporting bullying and harassment in the workplace. Now, the disparity that always upsets me is that there's actually a really large proportion of people, thankfully, who feel confident in challenging. So I think off the top of my head, it's around the 80% of people feel confident challenging this type of behavior. But then when we ask, do you know how to report, that drops to somewhere like 65. So there's this real gap between people knowing how to do it. So make sure in your training, as well as empowering people to be able to report it, to be able to challenge it in the workplace, make sure they then know how to report it. So take that next step and be able to report that in the workplace. Some further ideas, just as I kind of round up this bit of the panel. Measuring success is really important, and this comes down to monitoring. Sometimes, like recognizing identities on workplace systems, this can be a systems issue, but there are ways to get around it. By measuring success, I talk about things like, are you analyzing your application to appointment success on the grounds of different identities? You should be doing it for gender, for disability, for race, for sexual orientation. You can do it for faith and belief as well. But to do that correctly, you've got to make sure you're asking the right questions. Language changes, but language is really important. And a lot of the time I see that LGBT people haven't disclosed their identity at the recruitment stage or in the workplace because the right question hasn't been asked and their identity isn't recognized there, or it's using outdated and harmful language that I especially see when organizations ask around gender identity and trans identities in the workplace. The second thing there, internal communications. Are you constantly reaffirming your commitment to LGBT identities, using opportunities like LGBT History Month or specific days? Clearly here we're talking about Pride, we're leading up to a big event, but make sure that is year round as well. Career development. Networks are a really good channel for this, and use your network as a way to use positive action and make sure that the LGBT people in your organization do feel that those career opportunities or development opportunities are there for them. And are you also using specific LGBT opportunities? Stonewall every year, don't worry, this isn't just a plug, but it's an example of us doing things like our workplace conferences that we run. And are you investing in LGBT people in your organization to attend those conferences and allow them that opportunity of career progression and development? And finally, just as I wrap up, thinking about exit interviews. Often people focus so much on bringing people into the organization, they forget about people leaving. I'd hope that when people leave the organization, they won't talk about the LGBT discrimination they faced because it didn't happen, but would be naive to think that it didn't at all. So actually you need a mechanism there to make sure that people can talk about any LGBT inclusion issues that they faced whilst in your organization to be able to act on them once they've left the organization. So that's me. The final bit that I know Wayne said something very similar to this, which I know we all believe being here, is that people really do perform better when they can be themselves. And there's loads of things you can do to enable that in your workplace. I'm going to stop now because I'm a little bit over, but do ask questions. I'll be more than happy to answer them at the panel at the end. And also, if you've got any other questions about how you as an organization can work with Stonewall going forward, I'll be more than happy to speak to you after. So you can always get my email at the end in some kind of virtual way. But I'm going to stop sharing, and thanks so much for listening.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Can I get a thumbs up? Okay, lovely. I couldn't hear David, so I thought there might have been a problem with the sound. So if everyone can hear me, I will get started. So after that incredibly slick presentation by Stonewall, very impressed, learned loads, you're now going to be subjected to someone that hasn't actually done a webinar about their community group before. So it might be slightly under. So if anyone wants to jump in or ask any questions before the end, please do. So my name is Bergs, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the facilitator of the LGBT Reading Group Gloucestershire. So how does this link in with the fire service, you may ask? Well, I will get there in just a second. The LGBT Reading Group was formed a few years ago because myself, as a member of the LGBT community, couldn't quite find anything that spoke to me. I didn't want to go out to a bar. I wanted to form some form of community, but I felt that the LGBT community as a whole was really residing in their own pockets. So there was a lesbian group, a gay group, a trans group. And I decided that I wanted to create a group where we could all come together. And the sort of drive behind that was what we're talking about right now, which is inclusion. And what I'm really passionate about is actually sharing commonality and sharing stories. And the only way we can really learn about each other and therefore include each other in society is by listening to each other and experiencing the different lifestyles of every member of the LGBTQ community. So what I thought I would do over the weekend to sort of prepare for today was I thought I would have a look and see if I could find any literature on LGBTQ firefighters, having never really come across that genre before. So I typed it into Google and I was slightly surprised. So I'm not saying go and do it now, you can do it later, but nearly every single book was about gay men. And they were all in that kind of genre. How can I say? It was the erotica genre. So as I was looking through all these covers, there are a few things sort of springing out at me. The firefighter tends to be seen as male. I couldn't find much female firefighter literature, and also they tend to be, quite sexualized as the male body form. And thirdly, every book cover, they were white. So I was thinking, okay, so I'm looking at a firefighter. They're male, they're white, they're all pretty muscular as far as all the covers are going, but that's the market of where these books are. But it did make me wonder, how can we see ourselves in the fire service as the LGBTQ community if that's all we have to go on with this fantasy? And I know this crosses over into the straight community, and if it doesn't, please let me know in the questions. So I thought, okay, let me have a look for a female representation. Who is, the most well-known female firefighter, and does she have a book? So I had a look and I found a woman called Sabrina Cohen Hatton, and I imagine the firefighters in the audience will be like nodding their heads, they should know who she is. But her book was really interesting. So whereas all the other books had men on the front with flames around them, looking very brave and very heroic, Sabrina's cover had her turned away and it showed a firefighter's hat and a ponytail with her name on the bottom. And I thought, how interesting that there's hardly any literature about female firefighters. And the one book that I've found, I can't see her face. I don't really know what she looks like. I'd have to turn it over or Google her a bit more. And when I looked through all the other sort of literature about firefighters, apart from her one book, everything else was very masculine, macho. And again, as a woman, I've never felt that I would ever want to join the fire service. I just assumed it wasn't for me, having grown up with things like Fireman Sam. So I started looking at masculinity within the fire service. And again, I haven't had much time to do this, but I thought, as a woman, how would I feel? If this environment is, as they say, a very male environment, how would I feel as a woman going in there as a woman who dates other women? And I actually found some really interesting research, and that showed me that actually, if I was sort of dating a woman, therefore people would assume I was a lesbian. I'm actually bisexual, but people tend to assume you're a lesbian as soon as you're a female presenting and you say you're dating a woman. Apparently, I would fit in really well in the masculine culture of the fire service because we could all be, I could be one of the lads. I could be one of the lads, sit back, make me a cup of tea, love. If I played that game, apparently I'd fit in quite well, and studies have shown that lesbians tend to fit in more with male firefighters than heterosexual or feminine women. And this is because of the sense of other. We all want to fit in. It's all about being part of the tribe, part of the family. And as a woman, as a lesbian woman or a bisexual woman, by going in and being one of the lads, I'm fitting in. I'm cutting out possibly any sexual tension. And it's that family unit. We're getting rid of any awkwardness here. But again, where does that leave, heterosexual or feminine women that want to join the fire service? Where does that leave? So again, we've got very little representation. So we either have hypersexualized, gay male literature, or we have more masculine presenting women joining in and becoming one of the lads. That's not going to help us at all. So I think what I'm getting at here is how important representation is, and how within each organisation, and Nick spoke about this beautifully, we need really diverse representation so that everyone feels that they belong, and that they can actually see themselves going down that career path. If anyone from the fire service comes to your house, you want to feel comfortable in their presence. Say you're elderly and they come and they do like a woman well check, or say you go to an event. You want to see people that represent you. You want to know that the organisation represents the diverse society that we live in. Otherwise, how are they going to address the issues, especially staffing? How are they going to, offer a decent place to work if people feel that they can't be themselves? And I personal example of this. So I worked for an organisation quite a while ago, and I wasn't out, and I was talking to a woman, and she was on the phone, and she said something like, "Oh, I think I just spoke to a lesbian," and hung up the phone. Now, I was quite a young person back then. I'm older and I'm wiser now, but I was very shy, and it was my first day. And at that point, I thought, "Ooh, I think I'm going to have to stay closeted." And I remained in the closet for probably over a year, including when my partner sent flowers to my work to congratulate me. I still felt like I couldn't be myself. And it's these sort of microaggressions that people sometimes don't even hear themselves saying. And in a really masculine environment such as the fire service, I could see how that might come up, and it might be just banter, laddish banter. Again, I might be talking from a really outdated perspective because I don't know many firefighters. I have one friend who is a female firefighter, and I see her as a Wonder Woman. But what would be amazing if having one woman that's a female firefighter and all the different firefighters, when putting her up on this huge pedestal, it shouldn't be, all this pressure shouldn't be on this one woman. Sort of say, well, I'm going to do a really good job because I'm one of the only women, that's representing the fire service. That's wrong. We need to really look at wide representation. And so I'm going on a bit now. I think I'm all right for time. You'll have to give me a wave if I'm going on a bit. So going back to my reading group, we look at all different forms of literature, and this is so we can really smash through barriers. In particular, we look at Black LGBTQ literature, so we can get the Black perspective. We've read Giovanni's Room, written by James Baldwin. It's a beautiful book, and what that does is it talks about the narrative from a different perspective. We've looked at LGBT Muslim texts, interestingly enough, and it's these intersectionalities that we shouldn't be afraid to talk about, especially if, and this is just an example, if someone's living in a household where they feel that they can't be themselves, what you can offer as an employer is a safe haven, so that if there's a young person and they're living at home and they think for one reason or another, maybe religion, maybe family, maybe culturally, they don't feel comfortable being themselves, when they come to work, they have that safe environment. They can talk to work colleagues, they can have that safety net in this microorganism of wherever they work that they might not have, and they can build their own community with their work colleagues. If we don't have an inclusive culture at work and someone can't be themselves at home, where do they go? We're losing these people. So I think I have about 5 minutes left, and I can't be from the LGBT reading group Gloucestershire without showing you an example or two from a book. I'm sorry, here it comes. So I have this really old book, and I don't know if you probably can't see it very well, but basically it's very old. It's from the 60s. It's from 1967, and it's about sexual deviancy. Now, don't get too excited. It's not what you think. It's basically saying how if you're a gay man or a gay woman, they didn't talk about trans people back then. Trans people were not on the radar, even though we all know trans people have existed since the dawn of time. And they basically say how lonely you're going to be if you're gay, basically. And I think in the lesbian homosexuality, it says something like they will never be fully satisfied. They are unable to get married. It may seem like a homosexual lifestyle is a happier way of life than frustrated loneliness, but that's because they've never experienced a man. And for the male section, it says the homosexual way of life is intrinsically unsatisfying, and we must try and prevent the homosexual pattern from becoming established, and we must alter it whenever possible. Oh, shudder to think about it, really. So this is what people were reading in the 60s, and this was by a doctor from Cambridge. So, you know, he's got to be right, right? So fast forward into 2020, you'd think these outdated stereotypes would be smashed and then away, but unfortunately they're not, and it's mostly because people have these really outdated ideas that LGBT people can't live fulfilling lives, can't have successful careers, or that they have to stick to the careers that we would know. So if you're a gay man, you have to be a hairdresser, you have to love interior decorating. If you're a lesbian, well, maybe be a firefighter. Because we have these stereotypes, and we need to smash them. And I think once we can get a bit more diverse with our thinking, and that goes to all employers, we'll certainly be able to sort of touch upon all the different aspects of the community, and the workplace will just be a happier place where everyone can be themselves. I know that sounds very sort of happy, hippie, but it is true. It is true. And I do encourage anyone, if they're unhappy, you know, within where they work, to certainly talk to their manager or HR, or reach out to a community group. Check out, you know, the Stonewall website. It is excellent. I looked at it myself. I was guided by Stonewall to look for a different job because I looked at their list of top employers. So, you know, it's very important. I don't actually know how long I've got. How long have I got? Have I got 2 minutes? I don't know. 2 minutes. Oh my God. Okay. Let's get into the 20th century. So this is another book that we read at the LGBT reading group, and it's The Miseducation of Cameron Post. It's a very beautiful book, and I recommend it. And it's a young person's perspective, taking a big jump away from a doctor from Cambridge that just talks about us rather than, you know, our own experiences. And it's about a young girl, and she has trouble at home, and it's about her finding herself. So if there's any young viewers watching, I really recommend you either check it out, purchase it. I'm not being paid by the author or anything, but it's just a really beautiful journey of someone that doesn't quite fit in, doesn't fit in well with her family, and is trying to find herself, and she does make her own community, and it's just really, really beautiful. And if anyone has any other questions about a good LGBT book to read, or any community questions, because I'm just grassroots community facilitator, this isn't part of my day job, please drop me a question or you know, speak to me after. Thank you very much.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much, Bergs. I can't believe it's not your day job, or you don't do it that often, because that was pretty slick without the presentation, and just flowed nicely through. So brilliant. Thank you. I'm really sorry. Terrible time to drop out. Nick, thank you for your presentation. Really good. Bergs, I missed your intro, but I think you did a great job of both telling people what you do locally and community support and that kind of community reading group that they've created, but also your own journey. So really appreciate that. Please keep the questions coming. We've not got too many in so far, it wouldn't appear. So please do fire your questions in. Don't try and save them up and remember them until the end. We can take hold of them now, and David will direct them at the end of the session. So with that, Rachel, number two, number two by way of the fact that she's going second. There's nothing else there, Rachel, at all. So Rachel Salmon from Derbyshire Fire and Rescue Service, where she tells us she's been for 3.5 years. working in prevention and inclusion, and has also co-chaired the LGBT Plus and Allies Network for 2 years since its foundation. So she's also responsible for positive action within the Fire and Rescue Service in Derbyshire, particular work around attracting female staff, those from BAME backgrounds and LGBT plus community as well into the fire service. So Rachel's got lived experience that she shares through training and awareness sessions. So hopefully she'll create that link for us around LGBT plus and inclusion and positive action from a very specific fire service context. So away you go, Rachel. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Wayne. I will just share my screen. Can you just give me a thumbs up if that's worked for everybody? People, that's great. Thank you very much. So, like I say, Wayne, thank you very much for that introduction. Like was mentioned, I have worked for the fire service for around 3.5 years now. I've always worked in Derbyshire, and my background was actually in schools, and that was working in inclusion in a different sense. So particularly with young people who weren't in mainstream education, that was sort of my background. Like was mentioned, I'm mainly focused on recruitment and community engagement, and I may be able to sort of cover and touch on some of the points that Berg's mentioned, and that was really interesting actually for me to hear that from somebody who knows one firefighter and has done a bit of research and how that actually translates to my own experience. And if there's any questions about that at the end, if I've not answered anything, do let me know. As was mentioned, I'm also the LGBT and Allies Support Network co-chair, and I have been since its inception around 3 years ago now, and that's something that I'm very proud of. I'm very proud and privileged, I think, to work for the fire service, but I'm also very proud to be able to be an out lesbian within the fire service and how that's impacted on my career and where I've gone from that. So, I'm going to talk about legislation, which is really boring, but I promise it will be quick. And basically why we do positive action. So you don't have to do positive action. It's not a legal requirement, but it is within the Equality Act. And the Public Sector Equality Duty Report, which is within the Equality Act, says that the public bodies, so in this case the fire service, must have due regard to eliminate discrimination, foster good relations, so particularly between those with a protected characteristic and those without, and advance equality of opportunity. And that's really where positive action comes in. It's about looking at people who aren't represented within a service, so females, people from BAME background, and people from an LGBT plus background in particular. And we must work to reduce that disadvantage. So where that participation is low, so for in this instance recruitment, we must do something to change that. That being said, we don't treat somebody less favourably because of a protected characteristic. We wouldn't not invite somebody to an event. We wouldn't not offer them training. But equally, we wouldn't treat them more favourably. There's no quotas here. There's no 50% of this course is going to be female, 20% of this course is going to be from a BAME background, anything like that. The people who get in do so on their own merit. And that's something that is really important when we consider positive action. Nick gave a really good overview about positive action, why we do it, how to do it. And I'm really just going to talk about my own experience and my experience within Derbyshire Fire and Rescue Service. Initially, positive action was something that was run by a team of people, so by our head of department and by our positive action champions, so volunteers really. A couple of years ago, we put a new positive action officer role in, which really, for me, showed that commitment. And when Nick spoke about SLT buy-in and management buy-in, that was something that really started to show that. Not just doing positive action for 3 months in the lead up to recruitment and then getting rid of it, which I know a lot of people do due to budgets and finances, but actually putting a positive action officer in role to start to really engage with communities and do that consistently, not just turn up at events to say we're recruiting, to actually start thinking about how we can engage with our communities authentically, if I'm honest. Part of what we've done is around targeted advertising, and that has been advertising on diverse websites, but it's also been using things like Facebook. So using that new technology to look at how we can specifically target advertising. And that's been something that has probably been more successful with our females, because it is something that can be easier to sort of target. But it's definitely something that we're looking into, and we are getting more LGBT plus applicants all the time. We provide opportunities that are exclusively for what we would call our target group. So we've recently recruited right in the middle of COVID, which was quite challenging in many ways. And we did lots of online workshops, we did lots of engagement, lots of presentations, and they were aimed at our females, our people from BAME backgrounds, and our people from the LGBT plus community. And that's to ensure, again, like I said on the previous slide, that we've got that encouragement for people to take part in the activity. We've had a great amount of support and mentoring. I've personally been very lucky, I feel, to have had a mentor in a guy called Rob Taylor, who's one of our area managers, who's been great at looking at how he can progress my career, and that's been something that's been offered to our LGBT plus staff. But we've also tried reverse mentoring, and we did that. We had quite a lot of help from Jai, who is our Stonewall account manager, and also looked at local businesses and organisations who'd done the same. And we had our strategic leadership team mentored by more junior members of LGBT plus staff. I wasn't sure how it would work. I wasn't sure if it was a good thing to do or not. The fire service can be interesting sometimes in terms of rank, and how would it feel for a firefighter to be mentoring the chief fire officer, and how does that work? But it was really successful. We've had some real tangible gains from it. We've had so much more engagement for our fire authority, so our governance, which has been great to see. And we are actually now providing that for our group managers, so our next level down, which has been really important for us to talk about our lived experience. Really hit the nail on the head, really. The fire service is a white, straight, male environment, particularly on the operational side of things. And we know that our managers and our officers are white, straight males, with the exception of one person. We need to do more, we know that, but we also know that that won't change overnight. We need to get the staff in, we need to retain those staff, we need to progress those staff. But for now, having that reverse mentoring opportunity and starting to talk about different experience, for me and for my colleagues who've taken part in that programme, has been really, really valuable. We've looked at training to enable disadvantaged groups to consider employment, and that goes across the board. So we've gone into LGBT plus youth groups, and we've spoken about future careers. We've gone into a local older people's LGBT plus group called Golden Rainbows, and we've spoken to them about what we call our safe and well checks and making sure that they access those. But we've also gone into our, worked with charities, we've networked locally to go and talk to LGBT plus groups and honestly talk about experience. And for me, that's something that I really value. I'm very comfortable going in and talking to a group about my experience. And again, Wayne saying about walking, a mile in somebody's shoes. I can honestly tell them my experience, and I can bring colleagues who will genuinely, again, tell their own experience. And I think for somebody external to listen to somebody who works for the fire service talking about how they found it, I think that is really valuable. And again, echoing Nick's presentation, it's not just about recruitment. There's no point bringing these people into our service if we're not going to retain, and ultimately, if they want it, progress those people. Again, that's nothing to do with ticking boxes. That's not somebody getting a promotion because of X, Y, or Z. That's people coming in. We put things in place to retain those staff, to make sure they're treated well, to make sure they don't want to transfer services or leave altogether, and then look at ways that if they wish, we can progress. So, what have we done? I'm very conscious that this slide is just a lot of words, and we have got some pictures on the next slide just to make up for it. But what have we done? I can talk about positive action, but what really have we done specifically around LGBT plus? 3 years ago, around about now, actually, we had our very first network meeting. It was myself, a firefighter who identifies as lesbian, our inclusion officer at the time, and our station manager for prevention and inclusion. And that was it. And when we went around the room, 2 of the people there really felt they were there because they should be, because that was their jobs. And myself and the other firefighter sat there and said, we could just go down the pub, we could go to Costa and have a coffee and just have a chat. This isn't going anywhere. We haven't got the support. But we persevered. We did one more meeting. And at that meeting, 10 people turned up. And gradually, we've started to get more and more people authentically buying into the network. It's not about promotion. It's not about people joining for the wrong reasons. some people are allies and some people are genuine, I don't like using the term always, but role models. They're the people we can count on and tell stories and who are part of the LGBT plus community. And seeing that network grow has been something I've been really proud of, actually. And that's been really good to see that the people who perhaps previously weren't out at work, some people weren't out at home, have come to the network and access that. SLT buy-in, so our strategic leadership team buy-in, massive, absolutely massive. Without having that genuine, authentic buy-in, you cannot achieve as much. You can actually find blockers in your way. And we're very lucky that our SLT get it, for want of a better phrase, but also support it massively. So our current chief, who when it first started was the DEP, but Gavin Tomlinson, and our Director for Corporate Services, Judy Beresford, have both been part of the network from day one. And we have recently appointed a senior champion for our network, who's nothing to do with the portfolio. He's just genuinely interested in it. And that's been something, again, that starts, he can then go and share that within the service and it starts to generate more interest. Allies have been massive. So I mentioned that the fire service is, predominantly white, heterosexual and male. That's not to say that they're not some of our best allies. And I think we've seen that today with Wayne and what he said in his welcome. We need those people. We need to have those allies. And that's really important for me. We've had training sessions to allow people to become allies and train other allies up, which has been really good to see. And when we do station visits, so we will go out as a team and meet our watches, we will always talk about LGBT plus and the network and make sure that they want to get involved with that. And quite often we do come away with new members, people wanting to be allies, and people wanting one of our rainbow lanyards or wanting one of our pin badges. And that's really nice to see. We have this year, very exciting, been given a budget. So we can sponsor local Pride events, we can, buy some merchandise for Pride, but also that can go towards supporting our staff on conferences. So our LGBT plus staff going to CPD or going to certain conferences, so Stonewall, for example, and that's been something that's been really pleasing to see that's been supported right from the top. We've done 3 LGBT plus conferences in partnership with local organisations in Derbyshire, so such as the police and the university, and they've been great. We've invited people to those who aren't part of the network. We're not, preaching to the converted at these. We're starting to get people there who should be there, who need that training, who need that awareness and understanding, and making sure that they're supporting their staff in the way that they should be. So we're getting HR there, we're getting our response managers there to make sure that if somebody in their team did come out or somebody in the future did, then they should be supported. I've got a little shout out to Stonewall here, so Nick should hopefully be pleased. When I first started, this is not to do with me, it's just a fact of the timeline, we were actually 354th in Stonewall, and we weren't doing much. Policies were quite gendered, they weren't same-sex inclusive, we didn't have a network. And during that time, we went from 354th, 267th, 127th, and then 99th this year. So we just crept into the top 100, which everybody was very pleased with. One of only 2 fire services, I think, possibly. We're nowhere near Cheshire. Cheshire do a lot of good work, and we do look towards those. But it's those improvements that are making a difference. I've mentioned lanyards and pin badges. But pin badges in particular, we've recently, as if by magic, I actually have one here. I didn't plan that, but it looked like I did. So I don't know if you can see that, but it's got the trans and the people of colour aspect in there as well. And that's just allowing us to work with intersectionality and start to be as inclusive as we possibly can be. Job pages, we always talk about our LGBT network, we talk about our work with Stonewall and Derbyshire LGBT Plus, our local charity, and we try and make sure that people know that we're an inclusive organisation to work for. Going beyond, just writing it on the page, we have testimonials on there, we have blog posts that we put on as well to try and make sure that people know it is a genuine buy-in we've got. Reverse mentoring I've mentioned. The most exciting thing for me is that we actually have a rainbow fire engine. It unfortunately does have my face on the side, but it's one of those things that we'll learn to live with. And that's something that, again, has showed that buy-in. It's a wrapped fire engine, and it goes out to all of our community events, but it's also used for our driver training. So when we're training people to drive the fire engine, it's going around the county, people can see it. And again, that just that genuine buy-in that the rainbow is it is connected with the LGBT plus community, and that's something that we sort of promote through our fire engine and also our flags. So we've got several flags that we fly around the county at notable dates, but also sometimes because we want to. If I'm honest, most stations have a flagpole. We've got the bi flag, the trans flag, the more traditional rainbow flag, and then like the pin badge I showed you there. Again, just to show people that we are a welcome organisation to work for. We've offered confidential support, both to members of staff and regarding their family members, so particularly for people whose children have come out or are questioning their gender identity or sexual orientation. In particular, we've offered a lot of confidential support to male staff who find it difficult to come out in the workplace. And again, that's been something that I don't mean to sound too cliche, but that's been quite humbling for me, actually, to be able to share that and hopefully in some cases help those people to move forwards and to be able to accept themselves and be themselves in the workplace. Collaboration's been massive. Those who know things about the fire service or are involved in the fire service know that it's becoming more and more frequent. We share a building with Derbyshire Constabulary, but also all of our partners in the local area and wider. I think we're getting better at sharing things as a national fire service and as a national resource, and that's something that I'm particularly looking to engage with going forwards. We've always offered support at our 3 Pride events in the county, and that's something that we're looking to extend a little bit further out next year and hopefully take the Rainbow Fire Engine to some new prides. The hope was this year, but obviously with everything that's gone on, that's not quite happening the way we thought it would. We run lunch and learn sessions, awareness sessions, training sessions to talk about everything from, and as I've put there, including the B, the hidden B. So people who are bi, being erased really in many cases, and that was something that I was quite ignorant to, if I'm totally honest, and it was a massive area of education for me, and it's something I now really enjoy presenting on. But we also talk about intersectionality, we talk about positive action, terminology is a massive one that people still struggle with, the use of the word queer, the use of new terminology, and I didn't mean to end on this actually, but we have actually won some awards for our LGBT work. We got 2 personal awards, individual awards at the Regional Stonewall Awards, and we also got one through the Employer Network for Equality and Inclusion. And we've done more. I'm just really conscious I don't want to keep talking at you. These are some pictures of some of the things we've done. And I was looking back on this earlier and reflecting, and it's really nice to look back actually compared to where we were 3 years ago to where we've come to now. And like I say, I always try and bring my own experience into this. And Berg, something you said earlier really sort of resonated with me, really. My family haven't been supportive. And sometimes you will hear, it's 2020, nobody cares, my kids are at school and it's fine. I didn't speak to my mum because I'm gay. And that's been quite difficult for me growing up and somebody in their 20s to actually have that experience. And this is massively cliched, but there is that feeling of a fire family. And being supported in the workplace. And for me, if I hadn't had that support at a time that was quite difficult for me personally, it would have been a lot more difficult. And I feel that professionally and personally, I've been both supported and celebrated across the organisation by the people that I've met. And that's something that is really, really positive for me and really important. But there's still so much more to do. There's definitely more we can do around non-binary identities and trans identities. There's still more we can do to sort of raise awareness of people who are bi, and like was mentioned earlier in Nick's slides, the people who aren't disclosing that, there's work we can do around equalities monitoring and beyond. So this is a sort of what we've done so far, but almost watch this space and there's more to come. So how can you help? And I'll just wrap up with this really. Understand, and if you don't understand, try and educate yourself. I always try and say that if people want to ask questions, they can come to me, but I'm by no means the authority of LGBT+. I'm not the spokesperson for that sort of community. Stonewall are a great website, and I will often signpost towards that. Communicate with your communities. I hate this phrase, hard to reach. They're not hard to reach, just go out there and talk to them. Communicate consistently. Don't just go out and hand recruitment leaflets out, actually talk to them and find out what we can do differently. Specifically for managers, effectively line manage. I've had some quite negative experiences where I've come out, and that is something that as a gay person you can sometimes. I've got long hair, which apparently confuses people, and you can come out every day sometimes, whether that be to service users, new members of staff, whatever it is. Effectively line managing, don't shame, don't generalise, don't, as I've had before, oh, you must know Sarah because she's gay and she works for Tyne and Weir, where I've never been, but you must know her. Try and avoid those generalisations and stereotypes, and actually look at that person as an individual whose sexual orientation may form a massive part of their life. They may want to talk about it, but equally, does being heterosexual form a massive part of that individual's life, and therefore, does it need to be mentioned? Have an effective network is a really big one, and be an ally within that if that's something that you would like to get involved with. And challenge unacceptable behaviour. Try and find out those routes to report, like we mentioned earlier. But if you hear something, the fire service is a banter culture. It is. But if there's something that you think you wouldn't like to hear yourself, or you think is unacceptable, then do challenge that. And if anybody wants some sort of tips for that, then I'm happy to talk over that. And that is me. Thank you very much.
Wow, Rachel, thank you very much. Fantastic. And Nick Bergs, thank you too. Before we summarise, I think we've got a couple of questions we can go through, but I don't know if you just saw my balding top of head for most of that, because I was frantically writing notes and thinking about some of the stuff that we can do and learn from for GCC and for the Fire and Rescue Service in Gloucestershire as well. So much to learn, but I think we've got a few questions. So next we will go to a couple of questions that I can see, and then whilst I'm doing that, I'll just ask David to check for any others. The first one I'll start the answer to, and then possibly bring Rachel into, which is, what do you think are the next steps for ED and I for the Fire and Rescue Service? Well, it depends if you work in Cheshire or Derbyshire, for starters. That I think as a sector, as a fire sector, I obviously had an easy paper round, but I've been around it for 28 years. And it is professionally embarrassing and staggeringly frustrated that we still have the distance to go that we have to go. I have some personal professional views about what we need to do, and some of them are probably tinged by my rose-tinted view of the world, and that, you know, we can just treat everybody fairly, respectfully, like individuals, and embrace difference and embrace people for the contribution that they make. But I know the world's not like that. The world can be a cruel place, and the Fire and Rescue Service is a microcosm of society. So Rachel's mentioned it a couple of times. We are absolutely white, middle-aged, heterosexual. There's lots of banter. On the positive side, we are a family. And how can we use that as a force for good into places like Gloucestershire County Council, for example, or with your organisations that you collaborate with, if you're Derbyshire and you work with the police, or as we work with Gloucestershire Police? How can we spread that and make employers a family, not just certain groups of employment? Because food for thought for me on something that I think it was Bergs who said it, was around work can be a safe haven if you can't come out at home. I think for me, you know, again, one learning point, you kind of assume that work is going to be the second place that somebody will come out. Now, it might be the safe place. So how do we create that? So answering the question, it depends where you are and where your start point is. I think we have some national level focus on this. So the local government association have got a thing called an inclusive fire service group, which has got our political leaders around the table talking about inclusion in the fire and rescue service. So we really do need that top level governance buy-in and drive for services where they maybe haven't got the strategic leadership buy-in, like Derbyshire and Cheshire obviously have, and like Gloucestershire has. So we need to make sure we've got that buy-in, and then my personal view is everything starts from those kind of small seeds, and we've really got to put in some tangible and deliverable policy wording changes, approaches to how we engage with communities, approaches to how we onboard people. And I think one of the problems we've got, one of the barriers we have to that, is that we put lots and lots of effort into positive action for 2 or 3 months a year, and then we get people in and we've sold them something that doesn't exist. And that's the big issue. So it comes back to some of those points around, you've got the training element that Nick was talking about, not just the community engagement, the onboarding, the training, and then obviously Rachel's talked about some really useful tools and techniques around the reverse mentoring. So there's a whole raft of things that we can bring in. But ultimately, for me, again, coming back to some of the stuff that Berg said, was around how misleading stereotypes can be. We are a stereotypical, very low accessible organisation to underrepresented groups because we do not present ourselves in the right light. I think there's a massive way we can go nationally through the National Fire Chiefs Council to break some of that down and make sure we use modern, appropriate language that makes us look like an employer of choice. And then we back it up with some of the good examples about why people should want to come and work for us and why we're a safe place and how people can have a great career with us and it's a safe place as part of that family environment. But I think we need loads of training at all sorts of levels. So, Rachel, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything you've just said. I think from a local level for us, a big thing is going to be carrying on with training, and I've been asked a question about that, which I'm happy to cover in a moment. Carrying on with that training and making it relevant. I think Wayne, I don't know if your experience is the same, but fire service training back in the day perhaps didn't get very good press or reception, and whether that was just sending something out online and people just saw it as a waste of time. Trying to get those actual personal elements and that lived experience. We've recently started doing something called the Human Library, where everybody's like a book, which sounds very odd, but people can be different kind of facets of their personality. So Łukasz, who I worked with, talks about his life coming over from Poland as a student. I will talk about my experience of being LGBT and sharing those experiences. And sometimes you'll learn things about people you had no idea. And that's something, again, that forms that. Nationally and wider, I think more work needs to be done as a sector. And I think coming out of our inspection, coming out of HMI, stuff will come of that. And I know National Fire Chief Council are looking at that. But just a central pool of resources would be great, and isn't something we have at the moment. A national network to set stuff up is sort of happening, but had a little bit of a break. So sort of bringing things together nationally, I think, could make a really big change. So that would be what I would sort of suggest.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. So the next question I can see is, what does positive action and inclusion look like in a modern workplace? And I'll go to Nick. I'll do a little bit of a ramble just to give him that pause for thinking time. But obviously, Stonewall measure this. And they've been measuring it for several years. So from an inclusion perspective, and I remember going to one of the presentations in London, the annual presentations, and it was the year that Stonewall introduced the diversity champion. So those that were regularly putting lots of effort behind their inclusion approach, particularly around LGBT+, and they were consistently coming top 10. Nationally. So they were kind of removed from the Stonewall Index and became diversity champions to actually help other organisations out. And I know I've certainly tried to work with some of those organisations in the past, and they are an absolute mine of information. So I guess we'd look to them. But Nick, what would you add into a modern workplace?
That's where I mean, it's interesting. Like, what is a modern workplace? I think the first thing I thought of when I saw that is, sadly, it doesn't yet look like the norm. Yeah, positive action and inclusion still isn't normal in the modern workplace. Events like these are amazing, but for some people in this call, it might be the first time they've heard some of this stuff. And if we look wider, if we focus specifically on fire and rescue services, there will be some fire and rescue services in the country that maybe would never do something like this, or don't have some of the things that you have implemented. So it's not yet the norm, but we're getting there. I think what this made me think of, which I think is what I'd quite like to talk about, is, again, modern workplace. Right now in 2020, the whole world has been flipped on its head. Everything's different due to the pandemic. So what does it look like now in the way we're working? And actually, I know people have talked about it quite a bit, and we've got to look for those silver linings in what's happened in the past few months. a few of those silver linings are that the inequality that some of us knew already existed in the world has had a light shone on it. And sadly, we've seen a lot of the inequality that is still here in this country, in the UK, which I think a lot of people happily ignored and starting to realise that that's there. But also a slightly more positive side of that, in the workplace specific, we've all been working remotely, working online, working in really new and exciting ways. And if we can link that into inclusion and diversity and positive action, and Rachel, I agree with you. I don't like the term hard to reach communities because I think we can just reach them, but using those group of people that maybe haven't been reached before, especially fire and rescue service, you're a dispersed workforce. You haven't got people who are desk-based and quote unquote easy to reach all the time. But using the new tech that we found and the ways to reach people is actually quite exciting when it comes to inclusion and especially positive action. And the final thing I'll say on it is, in the modern workplace, I think the first thing around it is recognizing that modern doesn't mean everything is okay. And I know a few people have touched on this before, but in some of the public facing things that I do as Stonewall, I've been bucket shaking before, and people have told me, why are you a charity? Everything's okay. I think a lot of people thought 2013 Marriage Equality Act, everything's fine. There's an organization called ILGA that run a worldwide kind of ranking of countries in terms of LGBT inclusion, and they do a rainbow map every year. The UK aren't even in the top 5. We're rolling back rights of LGBT people currently, as are a lot of countries kind of as our neighbours, which is quite sad to see. And I think while some of that might sound quite downbeat, it's really important to recognise where we are, and there are a lot of things that we can do better in 2020. And if a workplace openly recognises that and stops trying to kind of hide and pretend everything's okay, then I think positive action and inclusion will come. So sorry, I covered quite a lot there, but I'd love to if anyone else got something to say on that.
Super, thanks, Nick. Anybody like to add anything before we move to the next question?
Very briefly, if that's okay.
Yeah, go Rachel, yeah.
I think a big thing for me, and I think I alluded to it in my presentation, is about that consistency, particularly regarding positive action, and not just doing it for 2 months in the lead up to recruitment and then getting rid of it, or seconding people into jobs and then moving them back, but also for our communities, and moving away slightly potentially from purely focusing on LGBT+, but not just turning up at Diwali with recruitment literature. Why aren't we going every Sunday for a month? We did something recently where we went to the Jamia Mosque in Derby, which is the biggest mosque really in the county, and we just went every Friday for 2 months, and we just spoke to them, and we generated a massive amount of safe and well checks because people understood what we actually wanted to do. We had people sign up for our awareness days. We had people consequently apply to join us. And it was massive because we weren't going there to tick a box. We weren't going there saying, oh, by the way, we're recruiting. Here's a leaflet. Take it to your sons, daughters, whatever. We were going and saying, what can we do for you? And we were doing that consistently. And I think that's such a big thing. Let's not just go to pride events with recruitment literature and send a couple of people. Let's go with a crew. Let's go with our chief. And certainly I know Gab will be keen to go, and Terry McDermott, our previous chief, came down fully rainbowed up and garlands and all sorts. And having that genuine sort of buy-in and commitment, I think, makes such a difference to communities. And I think that is so important moving forwards, that we're not just there to tick a box, we're there to genuinely engage with these people.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I think you can sum that up, can't you, with authenticity. Yeah, it's just something I was going to pick up at the end. It's come through. I think all of you have mentioned it at some point when you've been talking, and it's seldom found, but it answers a lot of ills. Just be authentic, well-meaning, be authentic, and it gets a long way. Right, rattling through some of the questions because they are coming in a little bit thicker and a little bit faster now. So thank you very much. Pleased that people are still out there. So good stuff. So Bergs, a very quick one. We're purchasing some books for an EDI library at headquarters. Where should I start?
Okay, I'm going to give you a really academic answer. Google. So basically, ask the community, come speak to the LGBT reading group. I would love to give you some LGBTQ inclusive ideas for your books. Same with anything. Go to the groups. If you think, okay, I want a really good varied selection, that deals with inclusion. I mean, Black Lives Matter is alive and kicking. There is so much information online of amazing like Black literature that talks about the history within the UK, even history within the fire service of racism. It all intersects. It is all out there. But when in doubt, go to your local community and ask them, and don't be afraid, because if you come to someone and ask them, it means you're showing an interest. There isn't you're asking in good faith. We want people to learn, we want to help, we want to be understood. I can't think of anyone ever going, just obviously, maybe if there's a work colleague and you're not sure if they're gay or not, and then you ask them in front of everybody, maybe don't do it that way. Go to an organization or someone that is open and confident. It's going to be like a really public ask as well, because just really quickly, what I find as a person of the LGBTQ community is that people will always find you. So if you're the only gay person in the company or whatever, this happens in smaller companies, you suddenly become the spokesperson for every LGBTQ issue known to man. And at the end of the day, I can talk about my experience and I can talk to you about some literature, but it's just my experience. I'm not an expert. So the more people you talk about, the more rounded view you'll have for any form of library. And the human book idea is a really good idea. You have human books. Do you need libraries? You could have your own human book event. That sounds really cool. So yeah.
Yeah, that resonated with me, but I just to make the point that I don't kind of want the whole workforce standing around near a bookshelf just waiting to be asked questions. Please kind of crack on with the work, and then but please be welcoming and open to the conversation. No, the human book thing I thought was a great idea, but no, thanks for that, Bergs. Google Scholar, Google. There you go. So one for Rachel, and that was about the content. So briefly, what content was included in your conferences and training? And did you do anything mandatory? Or if not, how did you encourage staff to participate?
So we don't as such do anything where people have to attend, because I think sometimes that can take away from what you're trying to achieve. We do, however, do a general EDI training for all of our new starters, whether that be operational or support. But we have recently, particularly with our whole-time employees, been really lucky that the EDI team have been given 2 days to work with them, and a session on that is always on LGBT plus equality and awareness, really. In terms of what we do, so the conferences are slightly separate because they are with different organisations. And what we do with those is we, as a group, so we have a committee that organise those, we all try and think about speakers and workshops that will best fit our organisations. The most recent conference, we had a guy called Drew Dalton from the University of Sunderland, who is amazing. I don't get any commission off these people, but he is really good. He talks around bi-awareness in particular, but he also talks about intersectionality, and particularly around queer Muslims. Very engaging presenter. Really, really good, and he's somebody we've used quite frequently, actually. He also does some work around being HIV positive as well. We also had a gentleman called Sean Delenti, who works in the education sector, and he did a lot of LGBT plus education before this sort of, it all sort of blew up a year or so ago. He sort of started that around 10 years ago, and again, really, really good speaker, really inspiring. We always try and engage with intersectionality. We've had lecturers, a guy called Rusi Jaspel, who I think was from De Montfort, who spoke around Southeast Asian, and particularly South Asian faith and LGBT plus. I've run conferences on, workshops on mental health. I have also told my coming out story, which was as a 24-year-old admin assistant at the time. It was quite entertaining to speak in front of 150 people, and we again try and share that lived experience. In terms of how we encourage staff to get involved, really I think there's just that commitment, and that sounds like an awful answer, but we don't make staff come. We will send out, we have a weekly information sheet every Friday, things will go in there, and we're just really lucky that we get the people, that there must be that buy-in, they want to know more. I know other organisations don't necessarily have that, and when we have the conference, each organisation gets 25 places. they're filled up with us straight away, and we quite often end up taking places off other organisations who don't have that same buy-in. In terms of the best ways to encourage, I think talking about what it genuinely is and how it can help them. And I know that sounds quite bad, because really they should be going, to help others and their own development. But I've spoke to people before about, so how would you manage if somebody trans comes into the team? Do you know how to work with people with different gender identities to the binary? Do you even know what they are? Can we work around that? And I think talking about that, I think you're in the fire service to help. Let's be honest, that for us, that's the reason why you would join. And I think if you frame it in a way that you're actually helping somebody, not just helping yourself, that can be something that tends to get people involved. But like I say, I think we've been quite lucky really in terms of getting people involved across the board in EDI training, not just in LGBT.
Super. Thanks very much, Rachel. Conscious of time, I'm going to take we've got a comment and then a couple of questions that we can combine. And it's worth picking up the comment because I was going to summarise with this. So Nick mentioned in his presentation that 2 in 5 people identify as LGBTQ keep their sexuality quiet at work, ? And Rachel also touched on it. Are there people who are open about their sexuality in their private lives but just keep it quiet at work? If so, I find that quite upsetting. I thought we were doing better than this. More of a statement. The stats are the stats, and worryingly, those are only the stats we know about, because we also have a massive issue with people not declaring. And I think not declaring is a sign of a lack of confidence in your employer or confidence in your workplace. So the issue is probably at least 2 in 5 people, and those are only the 2 in 5 that we know about. So completely agree. It is upsetting, and I would argue we are doing better than we were, but that's part of the journey. We are so far away and there's so much more work to do. And it really is about opening minds up, understanding more, being confident to have conversations and learn more to become more inclusive down the line. That will be my kind of summary of that bit. The questions that followed on from that, and take 2 together, probably to Nick, really. How do we develop positive action for LGBTQ BAME community? So touching on the intersectionality point, and appreciate the panel's view on how workplace wellbeing and employee support programs can become more inclusive. And I think that can kind of pick up the intersectionality point to a point as well. So I've come to Nick first on that.
So I was just unmuting myself. Great. Yeah, and just on that kind of point of it being upsetting, I mean, the specific stat there, the 2 in 5 was by identities in the workplace, and I think Berg spoke about that really well in the assumptions that people make when someone, you make assumptions on the gender of someone's partner, right? And that can be really hard for people to come out in the workplace if they're validated on the gender of their partner. So if someone to go in the go into the office with an opposite gender partner and then kind of had an assumption around that. But generally, I think when your point there about people, those stats sadly are probably higher because people don't declare is completely right. In terms of focusing on BAME LGBT inclusion, I mean, the first step really is recognizing that it's an issue. Now, there's always a great time to do it now when we've got the momentum of Black Lives Matter and things actually seem to be changing. This needs to be spoken about. I think there's a few kind of groundwork things to be done. A few people have mentioned policies, and policies can be quite dry. I spend a lot of my time reading policies. I've learned to love them, but they are the bedrock of an organisation, and policies reflect the people that you represent. And a lot of the policies I see, whilst they might give an example of what discrimination looks like in the workplace, it won't ever be an example of what discrimination on the grounds of a multiple base looks like, and really showing that. Also understanding bias. We've talked about, since again, Black Lives Matter, unconscious bias. I don't particularly love the term. I don't think it's unconscious. I think it's conscious, and we need to recognise that. We shouldn't give people that kind of get out of jail free card of saying, oh, it was unconscious, I just thought it. Recognise it for what it is and see how you can move on. And again, I've talked about the hiring practice. Again, a lot of the hiring practice, it might say, or split people into silos and say, this is how you can ensure that you're not bias against someone with a disability. This is how you can ensure you're not biased against, but don't put people into silos. Recognize that people have those different identities. Also, role models. We talked about the term role models, and it can be a difficult term. Sometimes it puts a lot of weight on someone's shoulders and say, I have to be that role model and step up in the organization. But where role models can be used well, or sometimes at Stonewall we use the term change maker, someone who talks about their experience. We use the phrase, you can't be what you can't see. And that can be difficult. I know if we think regionally as well, if you think about the area that you represent, I work in London, right? So I'm an incredibly area, and our workplace doesn't represent the area. We don't have nearly enough representation in our workplace. However, we think about different places in different counties in the UK, you might not easily find that representation. However, you should go further. When you're doing your internal comms, when you're celebrating throughout the year, are you using Black LGBT voices? We've heard the name James Baldwin today because he's one of the best authors ever in Giovanni's room. I'm so glad you mentioned it, Bergs. But James Baldwin's absolutely brilliant. He is a good example, but all too often people do use kind of people who have passed away or people who aren't around anymore. There's some amazing Black queer voices out there at the moment in the public eye and in the media. And how are you bringing those into your organisation? Rachel's spoken about it at conferences. Rachel's bringing in some brilliant voices there to the conference to speak about their identities. So always reach out further. And yeah, Stonewall have got a great collection on the website. If you ever want to look, if you Google LGBT workplace stories, it's a human library. It's basically a human library, but it's a whole range of really diverse LGBT voices from loads of different organizations speaking about what it's like to be LGBT in the workplace. And we've designed it so it's PDF documents that you can download and use in your workplace. So if you don't have that representation yet in your workplace, use ours, use those voices. They're there to share and show people that they can be that in the workplace and see themselves reflected for maybe the first time. I've spoken loads. I'm going to put myself on mute.
Thanks very much, Nick. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to bring it to a close at that point. I think David just confirmed we've picked all the questions up, and is any chance we can kind of publish any answers that we haven't managed to get to if they come in later? That would be really useful. So massive thanks to those that have joined in and asked questions tonight. And just for those that are watching, and obviously presenters, if you're going back to your own organisation, you might think the material is useful. So this event has been recorded. It's going to be uploaded to Gloucestershire Fire and Rescue Service website. I am pretty certain it will be going to all the other participants as well. So Royal Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire, Warwickshire. Have I missed anybody? Gloucestershire, we've already said. So I'm sure they will all upload links to it as well. So please push it out and direct people to it. I was going to spend some time summarising some of the presentations, but I think people have done such a good job and we've kind of run out of time. There's so much food for thought and notes that I've taken just around some of the stats from Nick and some of the good practice around how you can create those inclusive workplaces and positive action. Berg's big things in there sticking with me about just stereotyping and how damaging and how not to stereotype. You talked about fitting in. It's been an absolute bugbear of mine for years. I really struggle with this concept of having to fit in. I often talk to staff in the fire service and say, would you like your son or daughter to come and work here? And what kind of environment would you like it to be? And you don't know. I'm not saying this out loud, and maybe I should. Do we know what the sexual preference of your son or daughter is? Do you know what the religious beliefs are? Would you like them to work in an environment where it's embraced? And so I really struggle with that. But how that forces people to be closeted and microaggressions. I think we are a family. We're a great organisation that does great things. But those microaggressions can be really damaging, and we need to get past that so we can unlock the potential. And then Rachel, some great examples around what you've done in Derbyshire. So, well done, congratulations. And I think we can share a lot of that across the sector and wider employers as well to really take some good examples. Particularly the reverse mentoring, the way you engage with communities, I think is quite inspiring. I've been talking for a long time about positive actions, not just 2 months of activity before you want to recruit new staff. It's something you do all the time. It's about community engagement, not about positive action. It's about understanding your communities and being accessible. So, congratulations, and we'll be knocking on your door to find out about some of that. So massive thanks to Nick, Bergs, and Rachel. Great job. Thank you very much. Huge thanks to those of you that have subscribed and watched. Please go and talk about this. Great learning event, but it's no good if it just sits with 30 odd of us. Go and talk about it. Please engage, and I should have been doing this again. So you've got the other two events on the screen now, should have. So Wednesday 6:30 talking about trans awareness and acceptance, and Friday 6:30 talking about LGBTQ plus and hate crime, and then the virtual Pride event on Saturday that's not on your board there. But please do sign in. Tell your colleagues about it. If they haven't joined in this, please give us some feedback, and thank you to those behind the scenes who've organised, and all it leaves me to say is enjoy the rest of your evening, and huge thanks for tuning in.
Thank you very much.